We've all heard the idea that each generation in America does better than the last. But is that really true anymore? We're about to take a look at a century of wealth in America. And what you're going to see is this incredible story of explosive growth that honestly hides some really worrying trends. And we'll be using the work of economist Edward N. Wolf to help us unpack how the American dream has really changed. Okay, let's start with just one number, 8. Over the last 100 years or so, right up until the 2007 recession, the wealth of the average American household, after you adjust for population growth, grew by nearly 8 times. I mean, just think about that. That's a level of economic expansion it's almost hard to wrap your head around. So yeah, this unbelievable growth, that's the first part of our story. And on the surface, it looks like a classic tale of American success, right? A century of incredible economic achievement that just seems to promise prosperity for everybody. Seriously, if you went back to the early 1900s and tried to explain what was coming, people would think you were crazy. This massive, massive expansion of wealth is the headline story of the American economy. It was the engine that powered the American dream for decades. It just seems logical, doesn't it? If the pie is 8 times bigger, everyone should be getting a bigger slice. But this, right here, is where that simple story of growth just starts to fall apart, and it reveals a much, much more complicated and unequal picture. So let's dig in and see how all that enormous new wealth was actually spread around. This is where we start to uncover those deeply worrying trends that economist Edward Wolf's research really shines a light on. So while the total amount of wealth in the country was just exploding, something else was going on. Between the mid-1970s and 2013, the share of all that wealth held by just the richest 1%, it almost doubled. Just let that sink in for a second. The pie got bigger, but the slice for those at the very, very top got disproportionately, and I mean massively, larger. Okay, so while all this wealth was concentrating way up at the top, what was happening for the average middle-class family? Well, their story wasn't really about growing assets. No, it was about growing debt. As wages kind of flatlined and the cost of everything, housing, education, you name it, just kept climbing, a lot of families had to turn to debt just to keep up, just to hang on to that middle-class lifestyle. And it put them in this financial vice. The amount of debt people were carrying just skyrocketed, and the ratio of their debt to their actual income, it more than doubled. This just created this constant, immense pressure on average American families. This constant financial pressure led to this really dangerous condition that economists call asset poverty. It's kind of a clinical term, but it describes a terrifying reality: having no cushion. It means that if you lost your main source of income tomorrow, you literally wouldn't have enough savings to get by at the poverty line for even 3 months. You're just living paycheck to paycheck, right on the edge. So you have this combination of rising inequality and this deepening debt, and it created a system that was just incredibly fragile. And in 2007, well, it all came crashing down. This was the breaking point, the Great Recession. Hey, remember that incredible times 8 growth we started with? Well, this number is the terrifying flip side of that coin. Between 2007 and 2013, the wealth of the average American family absolutely plummeted by 44%. It was a devastating collapse that just wiped out decades of progress for millions of people. But what's really shocking is what happened after the crash. While millions of average families saw their wealth just get decimated, the share of wealth held by the top 1% actually peaked in the years right after the crisis. The recovery for them was even better than the boom times. So it was a crisis for the many and a huge opportunity for the few. And it's so important to remember the human costs behind all these statistics. I mean, this wasn't just about numbers on a spreadsheet. This was about families losing their homes, losing their life savings, their entire sense of security. And the data is crystal clear. Black families were hit the absolute hardest, suffering the most severe and the most lasting losses during this time. So when you take these two stories and you kind of weave them together, the story of incredible overall growth and the story of deep, painful division, what you see is a picture of a nation that has been fundamentally transformed. Economist Edward Wolf just summarizes this whole century-long shift perfectly. He says, the U.S. has changed from being one of the most equal to one of the most unequal. Think about that. This wasn't some slow drift. It was a dramatic reversal, a transformation from a leader in equality to an outlier in inequality among developed nations. And this brings us right to the core takeaway. The story of American growth, it isn't wrong, it's just dangerously incomplete. The real story of the last century is one of unprecedented growth that has been completely overshadowed and, frankly, defined by these deeply concentrated gains at the very top. And so this all leaves us with a critical question, maybe the critical question for our time. We've seen the data, we've walked through the history. The challenge now is this: how does the nation even navigate prosperity when the benefits are shared so unevenly? It's a question that's going to define America's economic and political